The Ruum by Arthur Porges. Read for you today by Hugh Carr. The cruiser Ilkor had just gone into her interstellar overdrive beyond the orbit of Pluto when a worried officer reported to the commander.
Excellency,
he said uneasily.
I regret to inform you that because of a technician's carelessness, a Type H9 Ruum has been left behind on the third planet, together with anything it may have collected.
The commander's triangular eyes hooded momentarily, but when he spoke, his voice was level.
How was the Ruum set?
For a maximum radius of 30 miles and 160 pounds, plus or minus 15.
There was silence for several seconds. Then the commander said,
We cannot reverse course now. In a few weeks we'll be returning and can pick up the Ruum then. I do not care to have one of those costly, self-energizing models charged against my ship. You will see,
he ordered coldly,
that the individual responsible is severely punished.
But at the end of its run, in the neighborhood of Rigel, the cruiser met a flat, ring-shaped raider, and when the inevitable firefight was over, both ships, semi-molten, radioactive, and laden with dead, were starting a billion-year orbit around the star. And on Earth, it was the age of the reptiles. When the two men had unloaded the last of the supplies, Jim Irwin watched his partner climb into the little seaplane. He waved at Walt.
"Don't forget to mail that letter to my wife,"
Jim shouted.
"Minute I land,"
Walt Leonard called back, starting to rev the engine.
"And you, find us some uranium. A strike is just what Chile needs. A fortune for your son and heir, eh?"
His white teeth flashed in a grin.
"Don't rub noses with any grizzlies. Shoot 'em, but don't scare 'em to death."
Jim thumbed his nose as the seaplane speeded up, leaving a frothy wake. He felt a queer chill as the amphibian took off. For 3 weeks he would be isolated in this remote valley of the Canadian Rockies. If for any reason the plane failed to return to the icy blue lake, he would surely die. Even with enough food, no man could surmount the frozen peaks and make his way on foot over hundreds of miles of almost virgin wilderness. But of course, Walt Leonard would return on schedule, and it was up to Jim whether or not they lost their stake. If there was any uranium in the valley, he had 21 days to find it. To work then, and no gloomy forebodings. Moving with the unhurried precision of the experienced woodsman, he built a lean-to in the shelter of a rocky overhang. For this 3 weeks of summer, nothing more permanent was needed. Perspiring in the strong morning sun, he piled his supplies back under the ledge, well covered by a waterproof tarpaulin, and protected from the larger animal prowlers, all but the dynamite. That he cached, also carefully wrapped against moisture, 200 yards away. Only a fool shares his quarters with a box of high explosives. The first 2 weeks went by all too swiftly without any encouraging finds. There was only one good possibility left, and just enough time to explore it. So, early one morning towards the end of his 3rd week, Jim Irwin prepared for a last-ditch foray into the northeast part of the valley, a region he had not yet visited. He took the Geiger counter, slipping on the earphones, reversed to keep the normal rattle from dulling his hearing, and reaching for the rifle, set out, telling himself it was now or never so far as this particular expedition was concerned. The bulky .3006 was a nuisance, and he had no enthusiasm for its weight. But the huge grizzlies of Canada are not intruded upon with impunity, and take a lot of killing. He already had to dispose of 2, a hateful chore, since the big bears were vanishing all too fast, and the rifle had proved a great comfort on several ticklish occasions when actual firing had been avoided. The .22 pistol he left in his sheepskin holster in the lean-to. He was whistling at the start, for the clear, frosty air, the bright sun on the blue-white ice fields, and the heady smell of summer all delighted his heart despite his bad luck as a prospector. He planned to go 1 day's journey to the new region, spend about 36 hours exploring it intensively, and be back in time to meet the plane at noon. Except for his emergency packet, he took no food or water. It would be easy enough to knock over a rabbit, and the streams were alive with firm-fleshed rainbow trout, of the kind no longer common in the States. All morning Jim walked, feeling an occasional surge of hope as the counter chattered, but its clatter always died down. The valley had nothing radioactive of value, only traces. Apparently, they had made a bad choice. His cheerfulness faded. They needed a strike badly, especially Walt, and his own wife, Shelley, with a kid on the way. But there was still a chance. These last 36 hours, he'd snoop at night if necessary, might be the payoff. He reflected a little bitterly that it would help quite a bit if some of those birds he'd staked would make a strike and return his dough. Right this minute there were close to 8,000 bucks owing to him. A wry smile touched his lips, and he abandoned unprofitable speculations for plans about lunch. The sun, as well as his stomach, said it was time. He had just decided to take out his line and fish a foaming brook when he rounded a grassy knoll to come upon a sight that made him stiffen to a halt, his jaw dropping. It was like some enterprising giant's outdoor butcher shop. A great assortment of animal bodies neatly lined up in a triple row that extended as far as the eye could see. And what animals! To be sure, those nearest him were ordinary deer, bear, cougars, and mountain sheep, one of each apparently. But down the line were strange, uncouth, half-formed hairy beasts, and beyond them, a nightmare conglomeration of reptiles. One of the latter, at the extreme end of the remarkable display, he recognized at once. There had been a much larger specimen fabricated about an incomplete skeleton, of course, in the museum at home. No doubt about it. It was a small stegosaur, no bigger than a pony. Fascinated, Jim walked down the line, glancing back over the immense array. Peering more closely at the one scaly, dirty yellow lizard, he saw an eyelid tremble. Then he realized the truth. The animals were not dead, but paralyzed and miraculously preserved. Perspiration prickled his forehead. How long since Stegosaurus had roamed this valley? All at once he noticed another curious circumstance. The victims were roughly of a size. Nowhere, for example, was there a really large saurian. No Tyrannosaurus. For that matter, no mammoth. Each specimen was about the size of a large sheep. He was pondering this odd fact when the underbush rustled a warning behind him. Jim Owen had once worked with mercury, and for a second it seemed to him that a half-filled leather sack of the liquid metal had rolled into the clearing. For the quasi-spherical object moved with just such a weighty, fluid motion. But it was not leather, and what appeared at first a disgusting wartiness turned out on closer scrutiny to be more like the functional projections of some outlandish mechanism. Whatever the thing was, he had little time to study it, for after the spheroid had whipped out and retracted a number of metal rods with bulbous lens-like structures at their tips, it rolled towards him at a speed of about 5 miles an hour, and from its purposeful advance the man had no doubt that it meant to add him to the pathetic heap of living dead specimens. Uttering an incoherent exclamation, Jim sprang back a number of paces, unslinging his rifle. The Ruum that had been left behind was still some 30 yards off, approaching at that moderate but invariable velocity, an advance more terrifying in its regularity than the headlong charge of a mere brute beast. Jim's hand flew to the bolt, and with practiced deftness he slammed a cartridge into the chamber. He snuggled the battered stock against his cheek, and using the peep sight, aimed squarely at the leathery bulk, a perfect target in the bright afternoon sun. A grim little smile touched his lips as he squeezed the trigger. He knew what one of those 180-grain metal-jacketed bobtail slugs could do at 2,700 feet per second. Probably at this close range it would keyhole and blow the foul thing into a mush, by God. Wham! The familiar kick against his shoulder. Eee! The whining screech of a ricochet. He sucked in his breath. There could be no doubt whatever. At a mere 20 yards, a bullet from this hard-hitting rifle had glanced from the Ruum's surface. Frantically, Jim worked the bolt. He blasted 2 more rounds, then realized the utter futility of such tactics. When the Ruum was 6 feet away, he saw gleaming finger hooks flick from warty knobs, and a hollow sting-like probe dripping greenish liquid poised snakily between them. The man turned and fled. Jim Irwin weighed exactly 149 pounds. It was easy enough to pull ahead. The Ruum seemed incapable of increasing its speed, but Jim had no illusions on that score. The steady 5-mile-an-hour pace was something no organism on Earth could maintain for more than a few hours. Before long, Jim guessed, the hunted animal had either turned on its implacable pursuer, or in the case of more timid creatures, run itself to exhaustion in a circle out of sheer panic. Only the winged were safe, but for anything on the ground, the result was inevitable. Another specimen for the awesome array, and for whom the whole collection? Why? Why? Coolly, as he ran, Jim began to shed all surplus weight. He glanced at the reddening sun, wondering about the coming night. He hesitated over the rifle. It had proved useless against the Ruum, but his military training impelled him to keep the weapon to the last. Still, every pound raised the odds against him in the grueling race he foresaw clearly. Logic told him that military reasoning did not apply to a contest like this. There would be no disgrace in abandoning a worthless rifle. And when the weight became really vital, the .3006 would go. But meanwhile, he slung it over one shoulder. The Geiger counter he placed as gently as possible on a flat rock, hardly breaking his stride. One thing was damn certain. This would be no rabbit run, a blind, panicky flight until exhausted, ending in squealing submission. This would be a fighting retreat. And he'd use every trick of survival he'd learned in his hazard-filled lifetime. Taking deep, measured breaths, he loped along, watched with shrewd eyes for anything that might be used for his advantage in the weird contest. Luckily, the valley was sparsely wooded. In brush or forest, his straightway speed would almost be useless. Suddenly he came upon a sight that made him pause. It was a point where a huge boulder overhung the trail, and Jim saw possibilities in the situation. He grinned as he remembered a Malay man-trap that had once saved his life. Springing to a hillock, he looked back over the grassy plain. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, but it was easy enough to spot the pursuing Ruum, still oozing along on Jim's trail. He watched the thing with painful anxiety. Everything hinged upon this brief survey. He was right. Yes! Although at most places the man's trail was neither the only route nor the best one, the Ruum dogged the footsteps of his prey. The significance of that fact was immense, but Erwin had no more than 12 minutes to implement the knowledge. Deliberately dragging his feet, Erwin made a clear trail directly under the boulder. After going past it for about 10 yards, he walked backwards in his own prints until just short of the overhang, and then jumped up clear of the track to a point behind the balanced rock. Whipping out his heavy-duty belt knife, he began to dig, scientifically, but with furious haste, about the base of the boulder. Every few moments, sweating with apprehension and effort, he rammed it with one shoulder. At last, it teetered a little. He had just jammed the knife back into his sheath and was crouching there, panting, when the Ruum rolled into sight over a small ridge on his back trail. He watched the grey spheroid moving towards him and fought to quiet his sobbing breath. There was no telling what other senses it might bring into play, even though the Ruum seemed to prefer just to follow in his prints. But it certainly had a whole battery of instruments at its disposal. He crouched low behind the rock, every nerve a charged wire. But there was no change of technique by the Ruum. Seemingly intent on the footprints of its prey, the strange sphere rippled along, passing directly under the great boulder. As it did so, Erwin gave a savage yell and thrust his whole muscular weight against the balanced mass, toppling it squarely on the Ruum. 5 tons of stone fell from a height of 12 feet. Jim scrambled down. He stood there, staring at the huge lump and shaking his head dazedly.
Fix that son of a bitch!
He said in a thick voice. He gave the boulder a kick.
Ha! Well, then I might clear a buck or two yet from your little meat market. Maybe this expedition won't be a total loss. Enjoy yourself in hell where you came from.
Then he leaped back, his eyes wild. The giant rock was shifting. Slowly, its 5-ton bulk was sliding off the trail, raising a ridge of soil as it grated along. Even as he stared, the boulder tilted and a great protuberance appeared under the nearest edge. With a choked cry, Jim Erwin broke into a lurching run. He ran a full mile down the trail. Then, finally, he stopped and looked back. He could just make out the dark dot moving away from the fallen rock. It progressed as slowly and as regularly and as inexorably as before, and in his direction. Jim sat down heavily, putting his head in his scratched, grimy hands. But that despairing mood did not last. After all, he had gained a 20-minute respite. Lying down, trying to relax as much as possible, he took the flat packet of emergency rations from his jacket and, eating quickly but without bolting, disposed of some pemmican, biscuit, and chocolate. A few sips of icy water from a streamlet, and he was almost ready to continue his fantastic struggle. But first, he swallowed one of the 3 Benzedrine pills he carried for physical crises. When the Ruum was still an estimated 10 minutes away, Jim Irwin trotted off, much of his wiry strength back and fresh courage to counter bone-deep weariness. After running for 15 minutes, he came to a sheer face of rock about 30 feet high. The terrain on either side was barely passable, consisting of choked gullies, spiky brush, and knife-edged rocks. If Jim could make the top of this little cliff, the Ruum surely would have to detour, a circumstance that might put it many minutes behind him. He looked up at the sun, huge and crimson. It was almost touching the horizon. He would have to move fast. Irwin was no rock climber, but he did know the fundamentals. Using every crevice, roughness, and minute ledge, he fought his way up the cliff. Somehow, unconsciously, he used that flowing climb of a natural mountaineer, which takes each foothold very briefly as an unstressed pivot point in a series of rhythmic advances. He had just reached the top when the Ruum rolled up to the base of the cliff. Jim knew very well that he ought to leave at once, taking advantage of the few precious remaining moments of daylight. Every second gained was of tremendous value, but curiosity and hope made him wait. He told himself that the instant his pursuer detoured, he would get out of there all the faster. Besides, the thing might even give up, and he could sleep right here. Sleep. His body lusted for it. But the Ruum would not detour. It hesitated only a few seconds at the foot of the barrier, then a number of knobs opened to extrude metallic wands. One of these, topped with lenses, waved in the air. Jim drew back too late. Their uncanny gaze had found him as he lay atop the cliff, peering down. He cursed his idiocy. Immediately all the wands retracted, and from a different knob, a slender rod, blood red in the setting sun, began to shoot straight up to the man. As he watched frozen in place, its barbed tip gripped the cliff's edge almost under his nose. Jim leaped to his feet. Already the rod was shortening as the Ruum reabsorbed its shining length, and the leathery sphere was rising off the ground. Swearing loudly, Jim fixed his eyes on the tenacious hook, drawing back one heavy foot. But experience restrained him. The mighty kick was never launched. He had seen too many rough and tumbles lost by an injudicious attempt at the boot. It wouldn't do at all to let any part of his body get within reach of the Ruum's superb tools. Instead, he seized a length of dry branch and, inserting one end under the metal hook, began to pry. There was a sputtering flash, white and lacy, and even through the dry wood he felt the potent surge of power that splintered the end. He dropped the smouldering stick with a gasp of pain, and wringing his numb fingers, backed off several steps, full of impotent rage. For a moment he paused, half inclined to run again, but then his upper lip drew back, and snarling, he unslung his rifle. By God, he knew he had been right to lug the damn thing all this way, even if it had beat a tattoo on his ribs. Now he had the Ruum right where he wanted it. Kneeling to steady his aim in the failing light, Jim sighted at the hook and fired. There was a soggy thud as the Ruum fell. Jim shouted. The heavy slug had done a lot more than he expected. Not only had it blasted the metal claw loose, but it had smashed a big gap in the cliff's edge. It would be pretty damned hard for the Ruum to use that part of the rock again. He looked down. Sure enough, the Ruum was back at the bottom. Jim Irwin grinned. Every time the thing clamped a hook over the bluff, he'd blow that hook loose. There was plenty of ammunition in his pocket, and until the moon rose, bringing a good light for shooting with it, he'd stick the gun muzzle inches away if necessary. Besides, the thing, whatever it might be, was obviously too intelligent to keep up a hopeless struggle. Sooner or later, it would accept the detour, and then maybe the night would help to hide his trail. Then he choked, and for a brief moment, tears came to his eyes. Down below in the dimness, the squat, phlegmatic spheroid was extruding 3 hooked rods simultaneously in a fan-like spread. In a perfectly coordinated movement, the rods snagged the cliff's edge at intervals of about 4 feet. Jim Owen whipped the rifle to his shoulder. All right, this was going to be just like the rapid fire for record back at Benning. Only at Benning, they didn't expect good shooting in the dark. But the first shot was a bullseye, smacking the left-hand hook loose in a puff of rock dust. The second shot did almost as well, knocking the gritty stuff loose so the center barb slipped off. But even as he whirled to level at number 3, Jim saw it was hopeless. The first hook was back in place. No matter how well he shot, at least one rod would always be in position, pulling the Ruum to the top. Jim hung the useless rifle muzzle down from a stunted tree and ran into the deepening dark. The toughening of his body, a process of years, was paying off now. So what? Where was he going? What could he do now? Was there anything that could stop the damned thing behind him? Then he remembered the dynamite. Gradually changing his course, the weary man cut back towards his camp by the lake. Overhead, the stars brightened, pointing the way. Jim lost all sense of time. He must have eaten as he wobbled along, for he wasn't hungry. Maybe he could eat at the lean-to. No, there wouldn't be time. Take a Benzedrine pill. No, the pills were all gone, and the moon was up, and he could hear the Ruum close behind. Close! Quite often, phosphorescent eyes peered at him from the underbrush, and once, just at dawn, a grizzly woofed with displeasure at his passage. Sometimes during the night, his wife, Shelley, stood before him with outstretched arms.
Go away,
he rasped.
Go away. You can make it. It can't chase both of us.
So she turned and ran lightly alongside of him. But when Erwin panted across a tiny glade, Shelley faded away into the moonlight, and he realized she hadn't been there at all. Shortly after sunrise, Jim Erwin reached the lake. The Ruum was close enough for him to hear the dull sounds of its passage. Jim staggered, his eyes closed. He hit himself feebly on the nose. His eyes jerked open, and he saw the explosive. The sight of the greasy sticks of dynamite snapped Erwin wide awake. He forced himself to calmness and carefully considered what to do. Fuse? No, it would be impossible to leave fused dynamite in the trail and time the detonation with the absolute precision he needed. Sweat poured down his body. His clothes were sodden with it. It was hard to think. The explosion must be set off from a distance, and at the exact moment the Ruum was passing over it. But Erwin dared not use a long fuse. The rate of burning was not constant enough. Couldn't calibrate it perfectly with the Ruum's advance. Jim Erwin's body sagged all over. His chin sank toward his heaving chest. He jerked his head up, stepped back, and saw the .22 pistol, where he had left it in the lean-to. His sunken eyes flashed. Moving with frenetic haste, he took the half-filled case, piled all the remaining percussion caps among the loose sticks in a devil's mixture. Weaving out to the trail, he carefully placed box and contents directly on his earlier track, some 20 yards from a rocky ledge. It was a risk. The stuff might go any time. But that didn't matter. He would rather be blown to rags than end up living but paralyzed in the room's outdoor butcher stall. The exhausted Irwin had barely hunched down behind the thin ledge of rock before his inexorable pursuer appeared over a slight rise 500 yards away. Jim scrunched deeper into the hollow, then saw a vertical gap, a narrow crack between rocks. That was it, he thought vaguely. He could sight through the gap at the dynamite and still be shielded from the blast, if it was a shield. When that half-caste blew only 20 yards away, he stretched out on his belly, watching the room roll forward, a hammer of exhaustion pounding his ballooning skull. Jesus, when had he slept last? This was the first time he had lain down in hours. Hours? It was days! His muscles stiffened, locked into throbbing, burning knots. Then he felt the morning sun on his back, soothing, warming, easing. No! If he let go, if he slept now, it was the Ruum's macabre collection for Jim Irwin. Stiff fingers tightened around the pistol. He'd stay awake. If he lost, if the Ruum survived the blast, there'd still be time to put a bullet through his brain. He looked down at the sleek pistol, then out at the innocent-seeming booby trap. If he timed this right, and he would, the Ruum wouldn't survive. No, he relaxed a little, yielding just a bit to the gently insistent sun. A bird whistled softly somewhere above him, and a fish splashed in the lake. Suddenly, he was wrenched to full awareness. Damn! Of all times for a grizzly to come snooping about! With the whole of Irwin's camp ready for greedy looting, a fool bear had come sniffing around the dynamite. The furred monster smelled carefully at the box, nosed around, rumbled deep displeasure at the alien scent of man. Irwin held his breath. Just a touch would blow a cap. A single cap meant... The grizzly lifted his head from the box and growled hoarsely. The box was ignored. The offensive odor of man was forgotten. Its feral little eyes focused on a plodding spheroid that was now only 40 yards away. Jim Irwin snickered. Until he had met the Ruum, the grizzly bear of the North American continent was the only thing in the world he had ever feared. And now, why the hell was he so calm about it? The two terrors of his existence were meeting head-on, and he was laughing. He shook his head, and the great side muscles in his neck hurt abominably. He looked down at his pistol, then out at the dynamite. These were the only real things in his world. About 6 feet from the bear, the Ruum paused. Still, in the grip of that almost idiotic detachment, Jim Irwin found himself wondering again what it was, where it had come from. The grizzly rose on its haunches, the embodiment of utter ferocity. Terrible teeth flashed white against red lips. The businesslike Ruum started to roll past. The bear closed in, roaring. It cuffed at the Ruum. A mighty paw armed with black claws sharper and stronger than scythes made that cuff. It would have disemboweled a rhinoceros. Irwin cringed as that sideswipe knocked dust from the leathery sphere. The Ruum was hurled back several inches. It paused, recovered, and with the same dreadful casualness, it rippled on, making a wider circle, ignoring the bear. But the Lord of the Woods wasn't settling for any draw. Moving with that incredible agility which has terrified Indians, Spanish, French, and Anglo-Americans since the first encounter of any of them with his species. The grizzly whirled, sidestepped beautifully, and hugged the Ruum. The terrible shaggy forearms tightened. The slavering jaws champed at the grey surface. Owen half rose.
Go it!
He croaked. Even as he cheered the clumsy emperor of the wild, Jim thought it was an insane tableau. The village idiot wrestling with the beach ball. Then silver metal gleamed bright against grey. There was a flash, swift and deadly. The roar of the king abruptly became a whimper, a gurgle, and then there was nearly a ton of terror wallowing in death, its throat slashed open. Jim Irwin saw the bloody blade retract into the grey spheroid, leaving a bright red smear on the thing's dusty hide. And the Ruum rolled forward past the giant corpse, implacable, still intent on the man's spoor, his footprints, his pathway. "Okay, baby," Jim giggled at the dead grizzly. "This is for you, for Charlie, for lots of poor, dumb animals like us. Come to, you damn fool!" He cursed at himself and aimed at the dynamite. And very calmly, very carefully, Jim Owen squeezed the trigger of his pistol. Briefly, sound first, then giant hands lifted his body from where he lay, then let go. He came down hard, face in a patch of nettles, but he was sick. He didn't care. He remembered that the birds were quiet. Then there was a fluid thump as something massive struck the grass a few yards away. Then there was quiet. Owen lifted his head. All men do in such a case. His body still ached. He lifted sore shoulders and saw an enormous smoking crater in the earth. He also saw, a dozen paces away, grey-white because it was covered now with powdered rock, the Ruum. It was under a tall, handsome pine tree. Even as Jim watched, wondering if the ringing in his ears would ever stop, the Ruum rolled toward him. Owen fumbled for his pistol. It was gone. It had dropped somewhere out of reach. He wanted to pray. Then he couldn't get properly started. Instead, he kept thinking idiotically, "My sister Ethel can't spell Nebuchadnezzar, and never could. My sister Ethel!" The room was a foot away now, and Jim closed his eyes. He felt cool metallic fingers touch, grip, lift. His unresisting body was raised several inches and juggled oddly. Shuddering, he waited for the terrible syringe with its green liquid, seeing the yellow shrunken face of a lizard with one eyelid a-tremble. Then, dispassionately, without either roughness or solicitude, the Ruum placed him back on the ground. When he opened his eyes some second later, the sphere was rolling away. Watching it go, he sobbed dryly. It seemed a matter of moments only before he heard the seaplane's engine and opened his eyes to see Walt Leonard bending over him. Later in the plane, 5,000 feet above the valley, Walt grinned suddenly, slapped him on the back, and cried,
"Jim, I can get a whirly-bird, a full-place job. Why, if we could snatch up just a few of those prehistoric lizards and things while the museum keeper's away, it's like you said. The scientists will pay us plenty."
Jim's hollow eyes lit up.
That's the idea,
he agreed. Then, bitterly,
I might as well have stayed in bed. Evidently the damn thing didn't want me at all. Maybe it wanted to know what I paid for these pants. Barely touched me, then let me go. And how I ran.
Yeah,
Walt said.
that was damned queer. And after that marathon, I admire your guts, boy.
He glanced sideways at Jim Irwin's haggard face.
That night's run cost you plenty. I figure you lost over 10 pounds.
With very special thanks to my patrons. Producers for this episode: Hounds of the Hearth, Bean Show, Gina Foley, and Glenn Hutchins. If you enjoy this channel and would like to see it continue, please consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description below. I'll see you there.